Elizabeth Bathory. For 4 years, she lived inside a wall, not a prison with bars or a cell with a door, a literal wall. After her arrest in 1610, workers bricked up the windows and doorways of her rooms inside Choctaw Castle in Hungary, leaving only a small slot for food to pass through. No trial, no verdict, no sentence read aloud in a courtroom, just stone and silence. She had been accused of committing horrific acts against scores of young girls, mostly servants and peasants, lured to the castle with promises of work. The exact number of victims was never confirmed. Official records from the investigation listed around 80 names. Later accounts pushed that number far higher. Nobody knows the real total, and nobody ever will. Her noble status made her untouchable in the eyes of the law. 3 of her servants were found guilty and executed as accomplices in 1611, but Bathory herself could not be publicly tried or put to death. She was royalty, so they sealed her inside instead and let time do the work the courts refused to do. By 1614, her health had collapsed. She could barely stand. One morning, she told a guard she felt unwell. The next day, she was gone. August 21st, 1614. She was 54 years old. Guards found her lying on the floor of her sealed rooms, cold and still. No one was certain how long she had been there before anyone checked. Her body was buried in the castle grounds, then quietly moved to a family crypt. The woman accused of bathing in the blood of young girls died alone in the dark, behind a wall, with no one watching. Henry Howard Holmes. He spent his entire life lying his way out of everything. The hangman's rope was the one thing he couldn't talk his way past. During the 1890s in Chicago, Holmes built a 3-story building that investigators would later call his murder castle. Hidden chambers, sealed rooms, and trapdoors connected by corridors that led nowhere. People walked in and were never seen again. He was eventually caught not for the killings, but for an insurance scam that involved murdering a business partner. Even then, he sat in court and smiled. On the morning of May 7, 1896, Holmes ate eggs and dry toast at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. He thanked the guards for treating him well. When they asked for his final words, he looked at the crowd and denied almost everything. 2 accidental deaths, he said. That was all he would admit to. Nobody in that room believed him. The trapdoor dropped. The rope did not do its job cleanly. His neck did not snap. Instead, Holmes hung there, slowly losing consciousness, his body swaying in front of the witnesses for nearly 20 minutes before doctors confirmed he was dead. He did not struggle. He did not flinch. He just hung there, still and quiet, as if he was waiting for something. Before his execution, he made one final request. He wanted to be buried 10 feet underground, inside a coffin encased in cement. He said he was worried about grave robbers, but most believed he was afraid someone would do to his body what he had done to others. The prison granted the request. More than a century later, in 2017, his grave was opened for DNA testing. Investigators wanted to confirm he was actually in there and to put to rest the old rumor that he had somehow faked his own death. The results came back conclusive. It was him. The mustache was apparently still intact. Holmes had fooled nearly everyone in life. In death, he fooled no one. Albert Fish. He walked to the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on January 16, 1936, and he was not afraid. Fish had spent decades doing things so disturbing that the psychiatrists who examined him ran out of clinical language to describe them. He was convicted of murdering a 10-year-old girl, a crime that had finally exposed a lifetime of far worse behavior. In total, doctors identified 18 separate psychological abnormalities during his evaluation, more than any case on record at that time. He told anyone who would listen that God had commanded his actions. In his final hours, he was calm. Some witnesses described him as almost cheerful. Prison guards secured him into the chair following standard protocol, and he made no attempt to resist or delay the process. He had reportedly said he had no idea why he deserved to be there, which, given everything documented about him, was either the greatest lie ever told or the most chilling thing any condemned man has ever said. At 11:06 p.m., the current hit. The execution proceeded through its full sequence without any malfunction. A myth spread for years afterward that the dozens of needles Fish had previously embedded into his own pelvic region caused a short circuit in the chair. Official execution logs show that never happened. The chair worked exactly as designed. He was dead within minutes. His body was buried in a potter's field on Hart Island, New York. No one came to claim him. The man who claimed divine instruction had met his end in a room full of electricity, and God apparently did not intervene. Ed Gein. He never made it to an execution chamber. He died in a hospital bed, slowly, the way most people do. Gein had been declared legally insane following his arrest in 1957, after investigators found what was inside his farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin. He had killed 2 women. He had also been digging up graves from the local cemetery for years, keeping pieces of the bodies inside his home. He was committed to a psychiatric institution rather than sentenced to prison, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. By the summer of 1984, Gein was 77 years old, and his body was giving out. He was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital after doctors identified lung cancer that had already spread through much of his body. He deteriorated quickly. For several weeks, he drifted in and out of awareness, mostly sedated, occasionally whispering short answers when nurses spoke to him. Staff described him as polite and quiet. He died on July 26, 1984, from respiratory failure. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, right next to his mother, which felt appropriate to everyone who knew his story, and deeply unsettling for the same reason. His grave marker was stolen in 2000. Police recovered it in Seattle the following year, but cemetery officials decided to leave the grave permanently unmarked rather than risk it happening again. Ed Gein's name is on no stone, just a patch of ground next to the woman who shaped everything he became. Ted Bundy. He spent his final days telling investigators everything, and he still couldn't save himself. Bundy had been on death row in Florida for years, appealing his sentence, delaying the process at every turn. In the days before his execution, he changed his approach entirely. He sat down with investigators and described more than 30 murders in careful detail, offering names, locations, and methods. Most people who studied the case believed the real number was higher, but Bundy knew what he was doing. He was trading information for time, and the state had stopped accepting the deal. On the morning of January 24, 1989, he was escorted into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Relatives of victims were among the witnesses. His final words were short. He said to give his love to his family and friends, and then he was strapped into the wooden chair. 2,000 volts surged through his body. The smell of burning filled the room. At 7:16 a.m., the doctor confirmed he was gone. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, roughly 2,000 people had gathered to mark the moment. They lit fireworks, they held signs, they chanted. It was a reaction unlike anything seen at an American execution in decades. The man who had manipulated courtrooms, escaped custody twice, and charmed his way through interviews for years, had finally reached the end of something he could not escape. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, per his own final instructions. He chose the location himself. Even at the very end, Bundy wanted to decide where he ended up. Andrei Chikatilo. He never knew which morning would be his last. That was the point. Chikatilo had been convicted of 52 murders carried out across the Soviet Union between 1978 and 1990. His trial had been chaotic. He ranted from behind a metal cage in the courtroom, laughed at inappropriate moments, and exposed himself to the jury on multiple occasions. Once the verdict came down and the sentence was confirmed, something in him went quiet. He spent his final months in solitary confinement at Novocherkassk prison, barely speaking, largely detached from everything around him. Russian President Boris Yeltsin personally rejected his final appeal for clemency. After that, there was nothing left to wait for. On February 14, 1994, guards came to his cell without warning. That was standard Russian procedure at the time. Condemned prisoners were given no advance notice of their execution date. He was led to a small soundproof room, ordered to kneel, and shot once in the back of the head. It was over in a second. There were no public witnesses, no crowd outside the gates, no journalists with cameras, just a small group of officials, a single gunshot, and then silence. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. The location was withheld by the state and has never been made public. The man who terrorized an entire country for over a decade disappeared into the ground without a marker, without a name, and without a trace. Some people think a bullet in the back of the head with no warning is the most merciful way a monster like this could have gone. Others think mercy was the last thing he deserved. Drop your opinion in the comments. John Wayne Gacy. He ordered fried chicken for his last meal and a Diet Coke. Not a regular Coke, a Diet Coke. By the time execution day arrived on May 10, 1994, Gacy had spent years telling anyone who would listen that he was innocent. He painted clown portraits in his cell. He gave interviews. He filed appeal after appeal. None of it worked. He had been convicted of murdering 33 young men and boys, and 26 of their bodies had been recovered from the crawl space beneath his own house. Outside Stateville Correctional Center that night, crowds gathered to mark the moment. Inside, Gacy was brought into the execution chamber just after midnight. He appeared calm. He reportedly joked with the guards as they prepared the IV lines. His last recorded words, directed at a prison official, were two words: "Kiss my ass." Then something went wrong. One of the IV tubes clogged. A chemical reaction had caused the lethal drugs to solidify inside the plastic tubing. The blinds to the witness area were closed while technicians scrambled to find a new line. Gacy lay restrained on the table, awake, for somewhere between 10 and 18 minutes while they fixed the problem. Witnesses later described the delay as deeply uncomfortable. When the flow finally resumed, he closed his eyes. At 12:58 a.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 52 years old. His brain was removed after death for scientific study. Researchers found nothing unusual, no abnormalities, no visible difference from anyone else. Whatever had driven John Wayne Gacy to do what he did, it left no trace that science could find. Jeffrey Dahmer. The state of Wisconsin had sentenced him to 16 consecutive life terms. A fellow inmate finished the job instead. Dahmer had been convicted of killing 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. His crimes were among the most disturbing ever prosecuted in American history. He drugged his victims, strangled them, and kept their remains for as long as possible. When he arrived at Columbia Correctional Institution, he kept largely to himself. He occasionally made comments about his crimes that unsettled other inmates. Most of the prison population despised him. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a cleaning detail along with two other inmates, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. The three men were left unsupervised while working in the gymnasium restrooms. Guards were away for approximately 10 minutes. When they returned, Dahmer was on the floor with severe head injuries. Anderson had also been badly hurt. Scarver had used a metal bar taken from the exercise equipment. He later told investigators he had acted on what he described as divine instruction. Dahmer was rushed to a nearby hospital. He was pronounced dead less than an hour after the attack. He was 34 years old. His brain was preserved initially for research, then destroyed after his parents could not agree on what should be done with it. His body was cremated. There was no grave, no marker, and no public ceremony. The man who had spent years desperately trying to stop people from leaving him was gone, and almost no one mourned. Aileen Wuornos. She did not want to wait anymore. She asked the state to kill her, and she meant every word of it. Wuornos had been on death row in Florida since 1992, convicted of killing 7 men along the highways of Florida in 1989 and 1990. In her final years, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She fired her own legal team. She filed letters with the court declaring herself fully competent and demanding her execution proceed without further delay. She told reporters she believed people inside the prison system were poisoning her food and irradiating her cell. Whether she believed it or was simply done fighting, she had made her position clear. She turned down the formal final meal. Instead, she used her personal inmate account to purchase a single cup of black coffee from the prison canteen. That was all she wanted. On the morning of October 9, 2002, she walked into the execution chamber without hesitation. She was strapped to the gurney and asked if she had any final words. What followed was one of the stranger final statements in the history of American executions. She said she was sailing with the Rock and that she would be back like Independence Day with Jesus on June 6th, like the movie, with the big mothership and all. At 9:47 a.m., the injection began. She was pronounced dead at 9:53 a.m. She was 46 years old. Nobody fully understood what her final words meant. She had said she would be back. June 6th came and went without incident. Harold Shipman. He was a family doctor. He made house calls. He held his patients' hands when they were frightened. And somewhere between 1975 and 1998, he killed more than 200 of them. Shipman worked as a general practitioner in England for decades, trusted completely by the communities he served. His method was precise. He administered lethal doses of diamorphine, then signed the death certificates himself. Most of his victims were elderly women. Their deaths raised no immediate suspicion because Shipman was the doctor. His word was the record. He was finally caught in 1998 after forging the will of his last known victim. He was convicted in 2015 murders and sentenced to life with no possibility of release. The official inquiry that followed concluded he had likely killed at least 250 people, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in modern British history. He was held at Wakefield Prison. He gave no interviews. He offered no confession. He said almost nothing about what he had done for nearly the entire duration of his imprisonment. On the morning of January 13, 2004, guards found him hanging in his cell. He had torn a bedsheet into strips and tied it to the window bars during the night. He was 57 years old, 3 years short of his 60th birthday. That timing was not accidental. Under the terms of his pension arrangement, his widow stood to receive a full NHS pension payout and a significant lump sum only if he died before turning 60. Had he lived past that birthday, the payments would have been voided. Harold Shipman, who had spent decades deciding when other people would die, chose the date of his own death with the same cold precision he had applied to everything else. Richard Ramirez. The state of California sentenced him to die in 1989. It took cancer 24 years to finish what the gas chamber never started. Ramirez had terrorized Los Angeles and San Francisco in the mid-1980s, breaking into homes at night, attacking victims seemingly at random, and leaving behind crime scenes so brutal that investigators struggled to find patterns. He was convicted of 13 murders and sentenced to death. The mandatory appeals process in California, one of the most heavily backlogged capital punishment systems in the country, meant his execution date was never set. He sat on death row for over 2 decades, largely untouched by the sentence that was supposed to end his life. During those years, life on death row was not without its strange comforts. He received stacks of fan mail. He married a journalist who had written to him while researching his case. He gave interviews. He seemed, by most accounts, entirely unbothered. Then in 2013, his body began to fail. He had been diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, a cancer that spread quickly to his liver and lymph nodes. He also suffered from chronic hepatitis C, compounded by decades of heavy drug use. He was transferred to a medical facility within the prison system, where his condition deteriorated rapidly. Those who saw him near the end described a man who looked decades older than his age, with yellowed skin, thinning hair, and hollow features. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died from liver failure. He was 53 years old. No family member came to claim the body. The man who had called himself a creature of the night died in a hospital bed in the middle of the morning, eaten alive from the inside by something far smaller than he ever was. Charles Manson. He had convinced people to kill for him. In the end, he couldn't even convince his own body to keep going. Manson had been in prison since 1971. His original death sentence had been handed down the same year. But in 1972, the California Supreme Court temporarily struck down capital punishment in the state, and his sentence was automatically commuted to life. He never came close to getting out. He had orchestrated the murders of 7 people during the summer of 1969, including the killing of pregnant actress Sharon Tate. Crimes so shocking they seemed to mark the end of an entire era. He never physically committed the murders himself. He didn't need to. He had others do it for him. For nearly 5 decades, he remained one of the most recognizable inmates in the American prison system. He gave occasional interviews. He filed endless appeals. He received more mail than almost any other prisoner in California. He became a symbol, a face on t-shirts, a reference point for an entire cultural conversation about evil and influence. None of it resulted in his release. By early 2017, his health had deteriorated sharply. He was hospitalized multiple times for intestinal bleeding. Doctors confirmed advanced colon cancer and organ failure. He was too weak for surgery. In his final days, he was moved from Corcoran State Prison to a secure hospital ward, where he remained largely unresponsive. He died on November 19, 2017, from cardiac arrest. Respiratory failure and metastatic colon cancer were listed as contributing causes. He was 83 years old. After his death, several people fought over his remains, including his grandson and a man who claimed to be his son. His body was eventually cremated. The man who had spent 50 years commanding attention, demanding loyalty, and refusing to disappear had finally, with no choice in the matter, gone quiet.